If you can't hear the bell tolls from my microphone or your house, it is officially 7 o'clock.
Okay. Do you have any information if we'll have other members joining?
I've not heard from anyone now.
Okay. We have a quorum, so why don't we get started? Good evening. It is August 12, 2020. This is the Village of Lake Bluff Historic Preservation Commission regular meeting via Zoom. We have primarily discussions of the revisions to the Historic Preservation Ordinance tonight, but let's start the meeting, if you would, by calling the roll, please.
Certainly. Member Bergman?
Here.
Member George?
Here.
Member Nickel is absent. Member Richardson?
Here.
Member Liebolt is absent. Chair Kraus?
Here.
You have a quorum.
We have a quorum. First item is the consideration of the July 8th, 2020 regular meeting minutes. We received those in our package on Friday. Do we have any corrections, additions? Hearing none, I would entertain a motion to approve this minute.
Motion to accept the minutes as presented.
Second?
Second?
We have a motion and a second. We need a roll call vote.
You most certainly do. Give me just one moment.
I remembered.
And was that Member George with the second?
Yes.
Okay. Member Bergman?
Yeah, aye.
Member George?
Aye.
Member Richardson?
Aye.
Chair Kraus?
Aye.
The motion carries.
Third item on the agenda is an opportunity for audience members to address the commission on areas of interest. Do we have anyone in the audience who would wish to address the commission?
There is no audience joining us tonight, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, so on to the gist of our discussion tonight, and that's the Historic Preservation Ordinance revisions. We had a committee of the whole discussion Monday. Was that only Monday, 2 days ago? Took a full hour, had an interesting discussion with the trustees. Paul, I know you were watching.
Yes.
Sherry or Janie, were you watching?
I was not.
Okay, Paul, you want to give us your impression, and we can chat a little bit.
So Steve went through the presentation. You have a paper copy. I think you have a paper copy of it in your package. Went through the entire slideshow. I gotta flip a couple pages here. Yeah. So Steve went through the slideshow and did the presentation. This is pretty much the presentation that we have been seeing and enjoying over the last couple of hour meetings, and I thought the entire village board was very receptive to this. I had the feeling that they had all studied it and read all of the materials, and they all seemed to be very interested and very conscientious about it. So I was really pleased to see them spending that much time and asking some nicely detailed questions. Can't think of Trustee Ankerman asked a lot of questions about what seemed to me would be the size of districts, the number of houses to be landmarked, sort of the size, is this thing bigger than a bread box or smaller than a bread box? So she seemed to ask a lot of questions in that regard. I'm going to mispronounce the man's name. Charlotte?
Charlotte.
Regis. Sure.
Yeah, he asked a lot of nice questions also. I thought on point, and you're not going to ask those kinds of questions if you hadn't read the materials. You're not going to pick all of this up and just listening to Steve's lecture. So I thought it was a very nice presentation. And finally, at the end, we got to the 59th minute. And the trouble with the committee of the whole is it meets before a board meeting. And just about the time you think that the committee of the whole is going to get ready to start asking some questions, you get to the time clock and suddenly it's time to stop. And I thought Kathy O'Hara brought up a very nice conclusionary statement to all of this, in stating that she felt that we had a very weak ordinance currently, and that the changes to the ordinance was something that was going to bring us more towards the middle of other ordinances. She said it's time, time that we step up and do something really sincere and really important with regards to preservation in the village, which I thought was a very nice conclusion that she made. Those are kind of my responses to it. Nobody seemed to be throwing any bombs. There weren't any Molotov cocktails or anything like that. So I thought it went pretty well.
So a completely different experience than in 2005 when the presentation kind of got slammed, right?
It was much different than 2005. I didn't have any wounds. It was primarily because it was on Zoom. Lois, were you on the call?
I was.
Okay, so could you give us your impression, and then I'll kind of summarize.
Well, first of all, I was going to text you afterwards, Steve, and I didn't, but I thought you did an exemplary job of presenting the summary of the ordinance as it presently is, and then the changes that we are going to make to the ordinance in relation to its present structure and guidelines. So I thought you did a great job. I was really very pleasantly surprised too, as was Paul, at the positive reception. The questions they asked were very on point, good questions, and they weren't antagonistic questions. They're just good clarification questions, and they really seemed interested and supportive, and so I thought that the whole hour exchange was really very positive and hopefully bodes well for how things may go in the future with continuing down the road to ask to have the ordinance approved. I thought the questions were very thoughtful, and obviously they spent some time before reading over the materials and asking very good questions. And again, it was primarily Barb and Regis and Joy Marquis were the three who had a lot of clarification kinds of questions. And they were really mostly clarification kinds of questions. The one thing I didn't fully understand, maybe we'll talk about it a little bit more, was when Barb was asking the question about how do we determine the 50% square footage of the external space. I didn't. So maybe we could talk about that a little bit. Do you want to talk about it, Steve? Yeah. So anyway, I thought it was good.
Okay. I thought the person, I much prefer to do those things face to face, but because you can't see body language or eye movement or anything. But I thought the question, like everyone has said, I thought the questions were good. I thought the discussion was, they'd obviously read the material. My couple of takeaways that were a couple of the trustees, I think, were trying to grapple with how big this is going to be.
Right.
And I ultimately said, look, we've got a list. We got a priority list. That's probably about 25 homes. I don't know how many will go through landmarking. It's not going to be hundreds. It's not even going to be 100. It's going to be more than 10. But I tried to put a number for people to get a handle on. So that was one thing. I think there was some certainty there in terms of how many. The second impression that I got is there's still some question as to, well, why do we really need to extend all of these timelines? Why do we need to go up for a year? for an advisory review. Although I think the fact that the request we're making to extend the advisory review, having applied only to a landmark, and not to every structure, it had to be to a landmark, and we're committed to landmarking homes that that we needed to be landmarked. I think that resonated with the group. I think they thought, well, that makes some sense if you're going to landmark. So current owners and future owners know that that's facing them if they want to make a change. So I think that was good. But there still was this question lingering, and I think it is still there to some degree, as to why do we want this to be extended, and which houses are we going to pick, and all of that. And so I did one of my old teaching tricks. I said, close your eyes, and I want you to think about the one structure in the village that you don't want to lose, the one structure that you just love, that is to you what Lake Bluff is. If it's more than one, that's fine. But just think about what that structure is, and that's what we want to protect. That's the one. And if all of us have one, we're easily going to get up to 20 to 25. We want the home to have an opportunity to exist for as long as it structurally can be there. So I think I was surprised. There was some question, and Glenn answered those, as to what do neighboring communities do, and the 1 year is not uncommon. So I'm hopefully, I'm optimistic that we'll see some good conversation. We didn't really get a chance. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I know that there are a couple of questions around that, but you having them go through that exercise was good, but I think also the fact that we're really only extending it about 30 days, they really own the 245-day extension. I mean, that's really been their purview to extend it further.
Right.
The one thing that, if I might add, I think that there was some question about, and maybe we can spend more time talking about it here and then also with them, is historic districts and neighborhoods and why we are pursuing that. And so, yeah, I think that's something that perhaps needs to be supported and explain more to them about the purpose of districts and neighborhoods.
Yeah, we candidly ran out of time. I would have wanted another 10 minutes to talk about districts, but we started a little bit late, and that's just what happens.
Right.
So I think there is a concern around districts. I think we'll have to have more discussion around the concepts of districts. So and I think I forget, one of the trustees was right on point and said, so if we have districts, and if that district is 40 structures, that means all 40 of those structures are subject to the new landmarking provision, to the 365 delay potentially. The answer is yes. Right. And that's going to be one of the significant issues around landmarking. Now, the other side of that, of course, is that it is a vote, so 50% plus of the property owners will have agreed to put this restriction on themselves, but 49% theoretically would not. So we may have some discussion about what the threshold. Remember, at the last workshop, we had somebody had recommended 75% as the threshold. I think that's still fluid, but I think that the issues, all these issues, are in front of the board, and we just need to keep moving. So I'll go to the end first, and then we can go back and clean up some questions. I'm suggesting that we make some decisions as a committee, as a commission today, and get an ordinance in draft form that at our next meeting we can have a hearing and hopefully approve and send to the board for discussion. That's kind of the direction given the staff and legal input. That's kind of the direction I'd like to go. So Glenn?
Yeah, very briefly, Mr. Chairman, just to go back to one of your statements, I do want to make an important correction before we get away from it. So on historic districts, the ordinance does make a distinction between that's common on the North Shore, which is some buildings, some features within a district are contributing and some are not. So let's say you have
Right.
a district on the east side, there's a 2010 home in the middle of that that would not be contributing. The process changes. You're in advisory review instead of significant demolition review, but the timelines, the delay times for a demolition are still shorter. So I just wanted to be
Sure.
clear on that detail.
And to be perfectly crystal clear, to make sure I understand, if we have a contributing structure that the commission and the board would determine is contributing, that would, and if a district is approved and it is voted by the property owners, all the contributing structures would be held to the higher standard, regardless of the vote of the property owner for that district.
That's correct.
Okay.
And even
So-
non-contributing structures would be subject to review for alterations.
Right. Okay.
Oh, really? Like a 2010 home would be subject to review?
Yes, so there would be an alteration review, again, subject to that very short timeline. The demolition review would be an advisory review, so it's a slightly different process, but it's the same length of time potentially as for, if it weren't in the district. And then a contributing structure within the district would be like a landmark. It could go up to a year.
Oh, okay.
So I hope that's,
Which makes sense, because we're looking, I mean, it is part of a cohesive whole, so we want to make sure that we're not damaging the cohesiveness of what's there
I completely agree.
by something different.
Yeah.
Okay.
Review process is one of continuity. And so is the 2020 house or the 2019 house, is the changes to that going to be is it going to have continuity towards the rest of the district?
Yeah.
So,
It's a good protection. I mean, I think it's needed.
with that aside, Mr. Chairman, I did not mean to take us too far off of your train of thought.
No, that's okay. Any other commissioners have comments on where we are so far in the process? I see we're all here today.
Yes, we are. I have one question, Steve. I did not watch Monday night, but it's on page 9 of what you went over with them Monday night, and it says village can say no dash refuse permit. Is that what permit would we?
So page 9 is dealing with certification of a landmark.
Right.
That's in place now. No one has done it. It means that the property owner voluntarily agrees to be held to a higher standard. And that higher standard is allowing the village to veto a change to that property. So it in essence gives the HPC and the board much more control over what happens to the exterior of that house, but only if it's certified. Okay?
Thank you.
Glenn, do you want to address the 50% calculation that Lois had a question about?
Sure. So this is not an example made for this particular question, but it's a handy one. So we'll use it. This is a recent. Actually, I think this may have come before this group, 600 East Prospect. I'm not sure, but it was a rehabilitation.
prospect.
Yeah, you may be familiar with it. So right now, the way this works, I'm scrolling down a bit, is to figure out what is a demolition and what's not. You're looking at plans like this, right? We have a floor area. We have a plan, a floor plan, and we're looking at floor area.
Right.
And the calculation is perhaps a bit unintuitive or perhaps not totally lined up with your what you're concerned about with this ordinance, right? So here are some rooms. We have this dining room. We have this living room and fireplace. We have a side room, a kitchen. And so when we do this measurement, we're asking basically how many interior walls are you knocking down? And the space on both sides of those walls we consider to be altered for figuring out if something's a demolition or not. So if by the time you knock down your walls, your structural walls, what have you, if you've eaten up over 50% of the floor area, that's, you have a demolition and you are required to go to review by the HPC. That's even if the end product, and there was a great example of this when I first got here, I think on West Washington, but even if the end product keeps the exterior envelope relatively the same, if you have a gut renovation, that would require review potentially by this body for historic preservation concerns.
Right.
So that's, again, unpredictable, maybe not very in line with the ordinance. What we've tried to do that we think is reasonable, I think this is a good example, is to say that we're going to look at the exterior walls, essentially on elevation, and we need to finesse this language a bit more in a couple ways I'll talk about, but we're going to take an elevation like this, and we're going to go based on this square footage, based on this area, right? So a one-story house, a two-story house, there's some nuance there, but essentially we're trying to use a metric that's very tied into how much is a house changing. So understand that, I have a four-sided house. I build a big addition off of one side. I'll go back to illustrate. I build a big addition over here, let's say. Understand that would, no matter what happens, that's probably 25% that probably doesn't get into your demolition review. But when we talk about bona fide demolitions, or we talk about multiple additions, really big reconfigurations, those would be swept up in this calculation and come to you. In general, I would expect it would bring fewer projects on the whole forward. And the stuff that this body's looked at in the last year or two, I can't think of an example that probably wouldn't have. There weren't any that come to my mind that were close. I did speak with Ed Deegan today, who, as you know, does quite a bit of rehab work in the village. He's one of a few calls I'm hoping to make, but if it gives you some perspective, his reaction was that, yes, this is an additional calculation, and perhaps it would take 2 to 3 hours to complete at the long end. But the alternative, having to, go through a preservation review for a project that is not a true demolition, he said that the prep work, the time for multiple members of his staff to attend the meeting and so on, pretty quickly gets into the 20 to 30 hour commitment for his firm instead of 2 to 3. So he thought, his first reaction was that this was preferable, which is, I think, what we like to hear. Is that a good explanation?
Well, I know the shift that we're making from square footage, the internal square footage, but Barb was asking, like, if you look from the top down, are we looking from the top down, or are we looking at the side elevation? That's the two different ways of looking at the external square footage was what I didn't understand what she was asking, but maybe that's irrelevant. You just explained we just are looking at the elevation and the square footage of it.
Yeah, this
Do you remember
is. This is, and maybe proportion square footage, whatever's more simpler to describe it as. But I think we might rephrase that a bit to say elevations explicitly. And then something that came up in my conversation with the village attorney earlier is, let's say someone resides their house. We probably need to be a bit more deliberate about saying that would not trigger a demolition review, aesthetic changes like that. So we'll, before you see this in September, we would sand down a couple of those edges.
Glenn, would you back your screen up to where you showed one of the floor plans? I think you showed us the first floor plan.
Sure. This one?
Okay. So when, I can't think of the trustee that was asking the question.
Barb.
Barb.
Barb, yeah.
So when she's talking about this top-down view, this is the
Yes.
top-down view that she's talking about.
Okay,
So you're hovering somewhere, 300 feet above the house and looking down onto what it's going to look like when you look at this in what's called a plan, okay? And so when you take Glenn's talking about taking all those computations off of the plan diagram, and what we're doing is we're shifting to taking the calculations off of the elevations diagram,
okay,
off of the sides of the houses, rather than
okay,
this look-down view.
okay,
Okay, because
okay.
if they go and demo a bathroom and a kitchen, you're going to end up busting out a whole bunch of walls internally.
Yeah.
Then it suddenly becomes in front of us, and they're not changing the outside of the house. It's happened a couple of times that we've had those.
This
Okay.
really makes a lot of sense to me to do it this way, because what we're more concerned about, we don't want to micromanage what people do with the inside floor plans of their house. We want to preserve streetscape, which is
Right.
the exterior.
And just to be clear, I'm making this a statement, but it's kind of a question. We are also not concerned with the new structure footprint. That's something that goes to the commission. So adding the whole new portion of the house wasn't our issue. Ours is, what are they doing to the old structure, correct? Did that make sense?
I think we do have some
Yeah.
about the new part of the building that goes in. Is it complementary? Does it play into the old part of the structure?
We have that power with the HPC. I mean, certainly we've been known to give our opinion on that, but I don't think we have any more than advisory.
I think we did that with the house at Scranton and Oak, the little yellow house with a wraparound porch on it. And it came before us several years ago when they wanted to make additions to the new part of the house, which is on the north end of that building, which was involving the
Are you talking
garages.
about Scranton and Maple?
Yeah,
Okay,
I'm sorry, Maple.
yeah.
And so they wanted to make some changes to the garages and the apartment, the living space above the garage, which was all new building. But we were concerned that the new building, the changes to that part of the new building were complementary to the old structure. And because
That home was landmarked.
yes, and because that home was so much higher in height, we had a lot of questions about it. And yes, you're right. I think 3 or 4 owners earlier had actually landmarked the house.
Right. Right.
But isn't that the purview of the zoning board and the architectural board of review to make those decisions? I mean, we can have an opinion on it, but I don't know that that's my question. Is that our purview to look at the new part or just consider the old part?
Well, it depends if it's landmarked. I mean, that little yellow house came before us because it was a landmark home, so any external changes they wanted to make
Right.
would come before us, correct?
Right.
Yeah.
If somebody is adding something new to a home that is not landmarked, if it would affect more than 50% of the elevation, then it would come to us, right?
Right.
Right. And so then it may end up going to both zoning and to HPC. I don't know, since it's a residence, I don't think it goes to ARB. Glenn can correct me on that, but I don't think it goes to ARB, but I think if you if you plan your addition, if you plan your new addition to your old house just right, you get an invitation to both, HPC, so.
If,
Only if there's if it requires changes in zoning, if there's a variance required, otherwise, PCCBA wouldn't apply.
if I could add, so if you have this with you, our fund new ordinance, I would perhaps direct you to, page 15, line 14 on. So, this is, you have demolition review, what are the purposes of it? You'll remember that we wanted to be a bit more broad, about this, not, we wanted to say that it wasn't just about picking homes to landmark, when they were proposed for demolition. We wanted to discuss other important, goals under the preservation ordinance. So, I can't quite tell from your conversation if there are differing opinions to what we have here, but what we wrote, I'll read out loud if it makes it simple. So, the commission is reviewing any proposed demolition of a building over 50 years old, in order that you are evaluating if it meets your landmark criteria. You're encouraging the restoration, rehabilitation, reuse of existing buildings, even where they may not satisfy the criteria for designation. You're providing feedback about how the work would affect streetscapes, even though streetscapes aren't within a district. And then you're capturing any important historic information before it's lost due to demolition.
Right.
Yeah, I didn't hear any difference of opinion.
Yeah.
And just to continue what Glenn did on page 25, beginning on line 30, is the review required for landmarks? I think that's the right place.
Yes.
And I think we're in full agreement on what our rights are, what the commission can do. But it's always good to discuss.
If I could as well, I took a moment to go back into and look around. This wasn't the property I was thinking of, but this is maybe illustrative of the type of project that perhaps would not come before this body that had to at one time. This is from March of 2017, 219 East Scranton. It's the Shaw House, I believe. So if you don't work with plans too much, this is the existing plan. This is them showing what's proposed for demolition. This is the site plan for construction. So they put an addition on the back. They built a new deck, and then they removed an existing garage and deck, and they reconfigured this driveway to build a new deck, new garage in this addition. So you can see here, these are reversed, right? This is the existing north elevation, and this is the new north elevation. I'll zoom out just a little bit. And so you can see some changes just in terms of this, the architectural terms escaping me, but they built this front porch. Western elevation, you can see mostly the roof line changes a bit here at the front and at these corners, but really this is basically unchanged. A door here, a window here, and then they build this addition off the back. So without doing the math for them, I would expect that this property, this project as an example, would not come before this body under the regulations that you've proposed here.
We were pretty enthusiastic about this project when it did come in front of us, weren't we?
I believe so.
Yeah.
And it looks
It seems to me
great.
that we wanted them to keep the snip peak of the roof, but they didn't do that.
Okay, I think we're in agreement. I mean, I look at this, the 50% calculation, the 50% number isn't changing, it's how it's calculated. and what I think the staff knows what we want. We want significant demolitions to come before us. We want especially we want interior changes not to come to us. So to the degree that we can find the correct definition that allows us to get just the right number of structures to us, we would love it. But I think we're fine with that. Glenn, I think we only have one real issue, don't we? I know you've got a couple here, but the one is really landscaping. Why don't we go to landscaping? Because I think, as I recall, that's the one thing that we needed to make a decision on that we sort of punted last month. So Glenn, if you could just review.
That was the piece that I objected to last month, and Glenn was kind enough to send a synopsis sheet, a single-page sheet to me earlier. I did not have a chance, Glenn. I apologize for not getting back to you. So I have to apologize publicly for that. But when I went through the guidelines that were listed, I thought they were all very much in conformity with some of the things we talked about in the meeting. So I'm quite supportive of the guidelines that you sent to me.
So which one, is that the built landscape discussion?
Yeah, I have a...
Before the joke gets away, Paul, I'll just note that if you can apologize publicly about 20 more times, you might just have a career in local government.
That's my failure. That's why I haven't been able to do that. So no wonder. Okay. Finally figuring it. After all these years, I'm finally figuring it out. Okay.
There's, hey, it's still time.
Okay.
So Glenn, can you just summarize the built, or the three landscape options? And I think we were focusing on the built landscape as the definition.
Yeah, so we've given you here three choices on how to handle landscapes in the ordinance. And again, I would emphasize that in some sense, in the other ordinances we reviewed, perhaps the net result of the ordinance is to regulate some of these things, but they didn't treat landscapes on their own as an object. That's a little unique to Lake Bluff, not that that's a good thing or a bad thing. The three options we gave you are essentially what you discussed at your last meeting. So the first is essentially to take this out of the ordinance, just to focus on structures and buildings. The pros there is that it's simple. These things are aligned to what the village already issues permits for and regulations for, or regulates, I should say. It's very, everything you look at will be very similar. To the extent we have expertise, it's architectural, right? I'm not sure we have a landscape architect on any village board. The second option is probably the closest to how the ordinance functions today. It's that idea of a built landscape, if you would. So we're not looking at things like courses of water or plants or trees or grades, some of which may or may not take a village permit to change. We're just looking at basically those things that do need a building permit, which happens to be the most designed or conscious parts of a landscape. So if we're talking about roads, walls, fences, drainage structures, most likely benches, planters, urns, fountains, lighting, signs, sculptures, man-made stuff, basically, that would be caught within the purview of the ordinance. And again, some of those more natural or potentially naturally occurring things that may still be designed, those wouldn't come before you. So advantages, again, still relatively aligned with what we regulate, still fairly easy to document for the purposes of monitoring it into the future. You look at it and you know what it is. Downsides, of course, are, you're kind of debatably, you're taking half a landscape, right? I mean, a landscape could look far different than intended or than its historic configuration, and that would potentially not come before you. So it is expedient, but it has challenges as well. The third one is essentially to take everything. It makes, for landscape specifically, it makes this process look more like the Architectural Board of Review site plan review than it does what you're looking at with structures. So in this case, all of those things you would have to go before the HPC to change. And then we try to make a definition of demolition that pushes some things into that higher category. We may finesse this a little more if you choose to go with this. So advantages, you get to see everything. You get a very strong lever to preserve the integrity of those landscapes you designate. I would say downsides, of course, landscape architecture is somewhat of a different discipline here. It's not something we typically have. Speaking on village matters, although we do have access to that through professional services. When it comes to things like grades and plantings and trees, we have those take more work to document as part of a landmark process. So for example, if I'm preserving natural grades, I probably need a surveyor to go out there and to take a topographical survey. That's probably at the village's expense. That's pretty substantial expense. I'm still small in the scheme of things, but you are adding a couple $1,000s. You do have more practical problems, when plants die and they're replaced, when trees die and they're replanted. There's a lot of things like that you'd have to work through in the administration of this ordinance. So I hope that's a good overview.
Yeah, great.
So, Paul, are you comfortable with Bill's landscape?
Yeah, I like the alternative B that we have, the alternate B that we, essentially what we have in place. I think Glenn pointed out, alternate C means that every time a tree gets cut down in Lake Bluff, it comes in front of us, and we don't want that. That's just crazy stuff. But there are a certain number of gardens in Lake Bluff and a certain amount of landscapes in Lake Bluff that I think we're interested in trying to preserve. So I think the alternate B is about as good as it can get.
Okay. Everyone else in agreement? That's kind of where many of us were last month. Remember that that if we add this to the ordinance and the ordinance revisions are adopted, that would simply give us the opportunity to add components of a built landscape to a landmarking designation. It doesn't mandate that we do it, it just gives us the flexibility to do it, which, Paul, is what I think you were looking for.
Right.
So we have that flexibility.
Again, I've said this before, it's another tool in our toolkit. We need to have a toolbox that's got plenty of tools in it, and this is just simply another one. Doesn't mean we're going to use it every time. Doesn't mean that we're going to become draconian about using it, but it's something that we need to have available to us.
Okay. Everybody in agreement?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I'm looking, Glenn, at your memo, and there were 3 other items that you wanted to talk about. One is just some timing.
Yeah.
So let's just talk about those other 3, and then I think we can make.
Yeah, so some quick bullet points at your, we'll go in order, I suppose. So what I just described earlier in this meeting where we talked about non-contributing structures in a historic district, a quirk of that would be that if it was in a district, it could be demolished faster than if it was not in a district. So we fixed that. Kind of the expedient way of fixing it involved lengthening somewhat the amount of time an alteration could be subject to review. So right now it was 35 days plus 30. As we first brought it to you, it was 35 plus 30, just to make the timing work without having to rewrite a lot of stuff. And also since we adjust upward other delay periods in the ordinance, that would become 35 days plus 60. So just a note there. Of course, we can rewrite it differently if that's not a desired outcome. Just that was, in drafting that, we saw that was the only delay period that hadn't changed. And so we still think that a 90-day total, perhaps with the village board's involvement, is consistent with the approach taken elsewhere. Of course, we're happy to change that. The other two, very little discussion.
So I'm fine with that. I think let's be consistent, and if this is more making sure it's administratively feasible and consistent with other rules, so I'm fine with that. The third bullet point is something that I had mentioned, and that's the limitation in the ordinance as drafted was for contiguous districts to have at least 10 houses. I said, why 10? I don't know what the right number is, but now it must be 0, because I guess that's in the ordinance. That there's no minimum or no maximum, and I'm actually fine with that.
I think that's great.
Okay?
Yep.
And then we don't need to look at clerical errors that be corrected. So
I'll just note that, as
Go
an
ahead.
example, page 18, line 6, 7, 8, just some things are left over from an older draft. So I just note that in passing.
we are very happy to have you and Ben make sure that all those things are correct. Okay, so I think we're at a point where we have the concepts of a revision to the ordinance. I would like to see a final, in final form of the ordinance, so that we could begin the process of approval. Ben, I believe we do not need a public hearing, but would that be a wise thing for us to do, is to inform the public that we're looking at a change?
Informing the public is always a good thing, but you will not be doing a public hearing. It's not what's in the code. I don't think you need or want to do a public hearing when it's not there. Now, that said, you can publicize this any way you want and certainly encourage many people as you want to turn out. And that's a policy decision of how you want to go about that. But I don't recommend transforming it into a public hearing, in part because it sets a precedent every time that there's a change to this, title of the code, a public hearing which can drastically alter how future amendments would work.
Okay, so, that's fine. That's fine. Ben, assuming that this ordinance is passed and that we have more restrictive provisions around modification to landmarks specifically, what will happen? Does anything need to happen with current landmarks, since they will now be held to a different standard?
No, I mean, it's kind of, the way this will work is this will go into effect, and then going forward, we will process pursuant to the new ordinance. Something that's already landmarked would be subject to the changes that you're making to the code. We do not have to go back to every single individual landmark and make changes. And if you think about your landmarking, the ordinances, or I think it was by ordinance that you've done them in the past, but all it does is say this property is hereby deemed a landmark, and it describes the property and sets forth all the great things about it. But there'd be nothing that would have to be changed with those, and it's just a matter of what they do, and then if it's triggered, they will follow what you pass.
Okay, good. So, Ben and Glenn, is it feasible to have this ready for us to discuss and potentially approve next month?
Absolutely. I think the only changes you'll see are, again, I would expect a little bit of change around that exterior wall rule. We'll give you a table in Table A, which those will be existing landmarks. I think that's it.
Okay. Everyone on the commission is okay with that approach?
It's great.
Yes, yes.
Good. Great. Okay, let's move on to commissioner and subcommittee reports, if any, and staff reports. So let me deal with the one thing that I have. Last month, I had put together a list of potential landmarks, starting with structures that are on the National Register, because we do have the presumption that they will be included as a local landmark. And then I identified 10 others. I would like to get the consensus of this group that we start with the National Register structures, and those include, just let me read what I've got here. So the Lester Armor House, Tangley Oaks already is landmark. Crabtree Farm and the Blair Estate, which are probably two separate landmarks. The Ralph Pool House on Green Bay Road, the Lynn House on Shore Acres, the Griffith Building, the Uptown Commercial District, and the Morse Ely Estate on Moffett Road. The Orangerie for Morse Ely is locally landmarked, but the estate itself is not. And so there's some decisions as to what pieces of that we want to have go through landmark. But I would suggest that we start there. I told the village board at the committee of the whole meeting that it's our goal to have one landmark per month at the village board level. So every month so that would be starting in, where are we, August, starting in October, I'd like to begin the process of having one landmark per month. And I think we start with these National Register, and to the degree that we have staff support to help fill out those applications, I think that would be a way that we could make that happen.
To the extent that we're starting with the National Historic Register applications, there are extensive applications already on file with the National Park Service. It's simply a matter of pulling that down, putting the cover sheet on that, putting our local Lake Bluff cover sheet on that, and stapling it together and submitting.
Yeah, it's not that hard.
I'm not going to add much more information to that. You might add a little update to construction changes and stuff. The pool house has been modified. Some of the other houses have been modified over time. I think the Morse Ely house has just gotten rehabilitated. So, there's probably a little bit of checking to be done, but not much beyond that. That's kind of, your list is kind of the quick and dirty list at this point.
Yeah, so. and I want to go there. By the way, there's some technical things that need to happen. So there's a statement of ownership, and there's a plat, I think, that needs to be part of the app. Whatever needs to be in the application, but the hard work's already been done, and I agree with the staple to it. I want to start with these to get everyone just rolling on it with the idea that we're going to do one a month.
Steve, will we have a process that we will go through with every home? Like, first we'll contact the owners, then we will provide them with the information about benefits of landmarking, or how will we, or with these homes that are on the National Register, will we just go ahead and do them? Like, what kind of owner involvement will we have with all of this?
So the goal is to do this with the cooperation of the property owner, with the active cooperation of the property owner. Okay. I would assume that if they're already on the National Register, I would assume that those discussions will be more straightforward.
Right.
But yeah, the intent is we need to put a process together. That's why I said we would do the first one in October.
Okay.
It'll be November if we have to get a process in place. But yeah, reaching out to the property owners, helping them put the material together, going through the review process at a public meeting. All need, we need that process to be done. I think once we do 2 or 3, it's going to be very straightforward.
Absolutely, yeah.
Especially
once we get a process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Steve, let me ask sort of a future-looking question.
Sure.
What happens if we get a National Historic Register district in East Lake Bluff?
Okay.
I mean, a big district.
Sounds like you're buying a lot of people drinks if that happens, Paul.
Yeah.
So what would we do? First, it would depend on whether there is a district approved, in the Lake Bluff ordinance. So if we have the ability to have districts in Lake Bluff, that's the first one. If that's a yes, then I think there's a discussion as to whether, we would have to discuss what the district is, how big it is, and whether it applies. Which brings up another question on ordinance drafting, Glenn and Ben. The presumption of inclusion under our regulations applies only to individual structures, right, that are on the National Register and not to districts? Or no, it includes the uptown commercial district, right? So any individual or district, there's a presumption of wanting to be included?
Just a moment.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, I hadn't thought of that. That's
Yeah.
Yeah, so, Mr. Schuster, unless you have a different
May
take.
end up with a district that is the Lake Bluff Camp Meeting Association.
right.
To your question, Member Bergman, Mr. Chairman, page 13, you'll see the criteria for designation are broken out into a section. Those are applicable to landmarks and districts. Right at the very top, we say any feature or area
Yep, okay.
on the National Register is presumed to meet across the bar.
Okay. Question answered. So Paul, the answer is, if that happens, we would need to have a discussion.
So there's a presumption, but not an automatic inclusion.
Correct.
Okay? So that the individual homeowner in a National Historic Register district would then have a vote or a voice in front of the Lake Bluff HPC. So if their house is in a National Historic Register district, and the question is, now do we start adding those National Historic Register district houses to the Lake Bluff HPC Historic Register designation? The individual homeowner can still object, still either say yay or nay.
Correct. So they would be able to present additional evidence and say, so what the presumption is they meet your criteria. It doesn't mean just because they meet their criteria, number one, you have to give them your designation. But two is be able to present their own evidence saying, I don't think these presumptions are correct. Here's why I don't meet the village's criteria.
Okay, good.
It would be it's an uphill battle if you want it, if you want it designated, it's going to be an uphill battle for them to overcome that presumption.
But it's still available for them.
It is available. It's not automatic. They can come in and they can rebut it.
Right, all right. Thank you.
Okay. So, Glenn, and Ben, so for next month, we're going to have a draft ordinance that we can review and hopefully adopt or recommend for adoption. Glenn, to the degree that you have, that you can do this, or you and I can do this together, is to think about the process of getting landmark applications before this commission every month. What we do, who does it. We may have subcommittees of this commission actually deal with certain National Register or certain landmarks and deal with the property owners, so we can maybe do 3 or 4 that we're working on at once. So we'll try to get those guidelines ready for next month as well. The only other thing that I have is Glenn is also, everything's with Glenn. The refreshing of Lake Bluff Online, which hopefully we can see some work once you get your additional staff working on that project. So by refreshing, I mean adding the information from the terraces specifically.
Certainly, I can tell you, we already have some staff resources assigned to that the last few weeks. So that is coming along. Perhaps, if the stars align, you'll be able to roll it out right about the time that you have a new ordinance. So we'll see.
Great. Okay, any additional business? I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
I'll make that motion.
Second?
Second.
We have a motion and a second. We need a roll call vote, right?
All right, Member Bergman,
Yes.
Member Liebel, Member George,
Yes?
Member Nickel,
Yes.
Member Richardson,
Yes.
Chair Kraus.
Yes.
The motion carries. You stand adjourned at 8:01 p.m.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank
you.
See ya.
you all.
Beautiful.
Take care.
Good evening, everyone.
Have a good night.
Good night.
Bye.
Goodbye.